Our next speaker is Kat Montgomery. Kat came to this program from the world of outdoor and environmental education. She first worked as a naturalist, teaching students about science and nature around California, and later directed an outdoor education program called the Coastal Institute. She came to Scripps to learn more about the world of marine conservation policy and find a way to use her interdisciplinary skills to help better manage our oceans. So over the summer course, we do one thing, we do a mock hearing during Governance Week. And it's like a mock Natural Resources Committee Senate hearing. And we assign various people various roles, from a tribal leader to a commercial fisherman, a processor, a buyer. It sort of runs the gamut of stakeholder roles. And I remember that Kat got the assignment of being the administrator of NOAA. And it was incredibly convincing. She seemed like she probably was the administrator of NOAA. And I'm incredibly fortunate to say that Kat Montgomery is going to be the summer course assistant this summer. I'm excited to spend 10 weeks with her. But after that, I have to assume she's probably going to be the administrator of NOAA. So, all right, the title of Kat's presentation is Over the Horizon: Opportunities and Barriers Facing Offshore Finfish Farming in the U.S.
About 90% of the seafood that we consume here in the United States is imported. Of that, about half comes from aquaculture, which is the farming of fish, algae, and shellfish. I first heard these statistics shortly after coming to Scripps, and they really stuck with me. I love seafood, like I really love seafood, and I wanted to understand where my seafood was coming from. So I started to look into aquaculture more, and I found that not only does it account for half of the seafood that we eat here in the United States, it accounts for half of the seafood that we eat around the world, the entire world's global seafood supply. That's because wild capture production, which is the amount of seafood that's caught from the wild each year, has remained relatively steady since the late 1980s. That's shown here in orange. At the same time, human population has gone up, and with it, demand for seafood. So aquaculture production, shown here in blue, has increased to meet the demand that wild capture could not. Here's what that aquaculture production often looks like. This is a tilapia farm in Thailand, and when it comes to finfish farming, by which I mean true fish as opposed to shellfish, a lot of it takes place in freshwater ponds, streams, rivers, and lakes. Farming in freshwater can be tricky because it often comes into conflict with human water uses, like irrigation and drinking water. These kind of farms can also pollute freshwater sources with fish food and poop. So in the future, human population is going to go up, aquaculture is going to need to increase, and the fact that this comes into conflict with humans in those ways means that it probably won't be the future of aquaculture production. The real potential for expansion is in the ocean. This photo shows a salmon farm in Norway, where fish are farmed in floating net pens. These farms are able to avoid some of those water conflicts that freshwater farms have to deal with, but coastal waters can be crowded, and so these farms can come into conflict with commercial fishermen, recreational boaters, and coastal landowners who don't want to look out and see a fish farm. They also have been criticized for environmental impacts, most notably if they aren't sited in areas with enough water movement, then excess feed and waste can accumulate on the seafloor and have negative effects on surrounding habitats. So it is possible to site these farms well in areas where there aren't a lot of uses and where there is a lot of water movement. But another option is to move out into the open ocean, where there's more space, fewer use conflicts, and strong currents to flush waste from the nets. That's the idea behind offshore fish farming, which is being done increasingly around the world in two main ways. In countries like China, Japan, and Norway, companies are partnering with large offshore oil and gas industry to design floating net pens that are based off of oil rigs. These tend to be huge, and they can withstand some of the harsh conditions of the open ocean. This one's called Ocean Farm 1. Here it's being towed out to its final operating position about 3 miles off the coast of Norway. And here it is partially submerged in operation. This farm has a diameter the size of a football field, and it can withstand 50-foot waves. In other parts of the world, primarily in Latin America, smaller independent companies are using a slightly different method for farming. They're using these fully submersible cages. And these photos are from Mexico, where a number of these companies have popped up over the last 5 years. So what about in the US? Well, what I found is that this type of farming has tried to come to the US. Right now, there's a few different proposed projects, one offshore of Long Island, 2 in the Gulf of Mexico, and 1 right here in San Diego. But these projects are all still under development because they haven't been able to get their federal permits. Some of them have been trying for years to get those permits. The one here in San Diego has been in development for over a decade. I found this really surprising, and I wanted to understand why, when offshore fish farming is taking off across the world, it isn't really being done here. So I designed my capstone project around these 2 questions. Why hasn't that industry really taken off here in the United States, and what would it take for that to happen? Ultimately, I wanted to understand the opportunities and the barriers that are facing this industry here in the US, and what the key barriers are and how they might be overcome. So this slide highlights some of the methods that I used to do that. Essentially, I did a really thorough literature review, and then I went out to meetings and conferences to learn from experts. And then I connected with as many people as I could who represent the industry, state and federal government, advocacy groups, environmental organizations, etc. This photo shows me with Donna Lanzetta of Mana Fish Farms. And Donna is one of those people who's trying to start an offshore farm in the US, actually 2. She's trying to start 1 in Long Island and 1 in the Gulf. I went out and I visited her in Long Island. I spent the day with her, toured her facilities, and I heard all about her convoluted process of trying to get her permits. Ultimately, I compiled everything that I learned into a comprehensive report, and then I made 2 shorter fact sheets, one geared towards lawmakers and one for the general public. So, what did I actually find? Well, this slide summarizes the opportunities that I found here in the United States for offshore fish farming. First of all, we just have a lot of space for it. Each country has something called an exclusive economic zone, which spans the ocean from that country's coastline out to 200 nautical miles from shore. And ours is the 2nd largest in the world, 2nd to France, fun fact. We also have a huge seafood market, one of the world's largest. So there's a lot of economic opportunity for domestic farms right here at home. We have a skilled workforce with experience that could help both design, build, and operate these farms. Commercial fishermen in particular could be really well suited for some of the jobs that might be created by this industry. And finally, the US Department of Commerce included expanding domestic aquaculture production as one of its main goals in its most recent strategic plan. So that says that there are those within the administration who want to make this happen right now. So these are the opportunities. Then I looked at the barriers. And when I looked into them, I found 5, but 2 of them really stood out as being the key barriers that are really inhibiting industry growth. So those are the 2 that I want to talk to you about today. First is the permitting process. Existing US law gives a few different federal agencies authority to regulate different aspects of offshore fish farming. So if you wanted to start an offshore fish farm right now here in San Diego, you would need to get a permit from the Environmental Protection Agency to put your fish food into the water because it's considered pollution. You would also have to get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers to take your submersible cage and tether it to the sea floor. Then you would have to work with California state and local governments to ensure that you're following all of their regulations and their policies as well. And each of these steps is really important because they protect the environment and the public. The problem is that Congress has never designated a lead federal agency to coordinate this entire permitting process. So you, the person trying to start a fish farm, you would have to navigate this system that can be difficult, slow, costly, and you would have to do it largely by yourself. One of the industry representatives that I interviewed for my report told me that they had to work with over 20 different federal, state, and local agencies in order to permit their farm. The other key barrier that I looked into was public perception. So this is the idea that there's just not that much support from the American public to start this industry. Most of the public doesn't know enough about offshore fish farming to understand, advocate for it, or oppose it, but there's a small but vocal minority who are strongly opposed to fish farming really of any kind. That includes some environmental groups that are concerned about the environmental impacts of fish farming, and some commercial fishermen who are concerned about the market competition. And some within that minority have, for years, have been putting out anti-farming campaigns, anti-fish farming campaigns. So I looked into some of those, and some of them I found to use a lot of inflammatory language and sometimes misconstrue the facts, especially when it comes to potential environmental impacts. But they have had the desired effect. A study that I read looked at news stories about fish farming in the US and found that 90% of them were negative. So the result is that much of the American public is quite uninformed about fish farming, particularly offshore fish farming, but they still believe that it's bad. I end my report with some suggestions for ways that proponents of offshore fish farming might overcome these barriers. So when it comes to the permitting problem, the process is costly and slow and complex, and one thing that could really help that is more coordination between the federal, state, and local agencies. But ultimately, we need new federal legislation that's going to designate a key agency to coordinate that entire permitting process. A bill that would do that was actually introduced into Congress last year, but it failed to pass before the end of the year, and so it was thrown out. And some of the people I talked to for this project think that it will probably be reintroduced this summer. So passing a bill like that is going to take educating members of Congress and also coordinating and finding compromise with some of those groups that have historically really opposed fish farming in the United States. When it comes to the public perception problem, industry proponents are really going to need to focus on education and outreach. What's needed is a really clear communication plan that conveys the potential opportunities as well as the costs of farming fish offshore in this country. This photo is from the Aquarium of the Pacific up in Long Beach. They have a program called Seafood for the Future that's spearheading a campaign to put together a communication toolkit. So they're bringing together all of this scientifically accurate information about marine aquaculture, and they have a focus on making sure that it is scientifically accurate so that it's rooted in fact. And they're going to have resources for policymakers, consumers, the general public. The fact sheets that I developed as part of this project are going to be integrated into that toolkit. And it's my hope that my report might be used as a tool for those who wish to dive deeper into fish farming and the information that's out there. So I told you at the beginning that aquaculture accounts for half of all the seafood in the world. My research has showed me that in the future, that's probably going to go up as human population grows. And that expansion is probably going to take place offshore. So what I'd like to leave you with is this thought. The United States, a country that consumes a lot of seafood, has a choice to make. Will we continue to import our seafood from farms in other countries and avoid the direct environmental and social costs? Or will we do it here, where we can regulate it and ensure that it's done responsibly? Thank you. I do want to quickly thank my fantastic Capstone Committee for all of their support. Mark, Diane, and Kim, Samantha, and Risa for making this year a great one. And of course, my fantastic cohort for constant inspiration, support, and a lot of good memories. Thank you guys. Any questions?
Hey, Kat, nice job.
Thanks.
I was curious, what agency would you recommend be the lead agency in this effort?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I personally, along with pretty much everyone I talk to, would recommend that NOAA be that agency, so National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They already have an Office of Aquaculture, but the bill that was proposed last year, which was called the Aqua Act, would create a new office within NOAA called, I believe it's the Office of Offshore, or the Office of Marine Aquaculture. I should know that, but I don't. So the idea is, that NOAA is ready to take this on. There are people within the agency that are already doing this kind of work, and they want to do it. But in order to do it, they really need that law. They actually tried to just go ahead and take over last year, but they were sued by some groups that said, you don't have the legal authority to do that, and the courts found that that was the case. So they're kind of in a stalemate right now. A great question.
Hey, Kat. So I had kind of a similar question about who should step into that role of the lead coordinating agency, but I was wondering more for nearshore aquaculture, is there something analogous? Does NOAA fill that job for them? And I know that there's a lot of lessons that offshore aquaculture can learn about what not to do from nearshore. Are there any positive lessons that they can learn about how to make this successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I focused really on offshore because it was most interesting to me, and it's this sort of like new and upcoming thing. But really, offshore fish farming and nearshore fish farming are not all that different. So I believe that whatever agency would take this on would oversee both. And NOAA right now is doing a lot with that nearshore aquaculture as well. They need a lot of the same permits. It's pretty similar. And then in terms of lessons, one thing that's really interesting, I used to think that fish farming was all bad and dirty and terrible. And it's really come a long way. So public perception hasn't kept pace with the science necessarily. And so in terms of lessons, like even nearshore, they've learned lessons and they're doing it better and cleaner and siting it well so that you don't have those issues. And offshore aquaculture would be able to build off of everything that's been learned through the industry.